Welcome online viewers. This is lecture number 10 in the series The 50 Years That Changed Painting, 1867 to 1917. My name is Terence Maloon. I'd like to thank Andrew Dyer and Donna Marie Kelly for having generously sponsored this series of lectures and its transfer online. My new painting does not belong to the earth exclusively. The earth is thrown away like a house eaten by termites. In man, in his consciousness, there lies a striving towards space, the pull of a takeoff from the earth. That's a quote from the Russian painter Kasimir Malevitch. The dream of flight. Dreams of flight are pretty much a constant across different cultures and different eras. What does that tell us about human nature? One thing we might be able to infer is that human beings have an imaginative capability which enables us to espouse or to attain a radically different view of the world and of the things of the world than what is actually physically possible for us to experience at a given time. What is the eagle's eye view? What is God's eye view? What does the moon see of our world? Imaginative displacement. It's a distinctively human trait. Virtually all forms of representation, all forms of art, derive from this faculty of imaginative displacement and are apprehended by virtue of it. On the left is the winged goddess the ancient Greeks called Nike, transformed by the ancient Romans into the personification of a victory. This is the famous winged victory of Samothrace in the Louvre. Beside it is an aerial shot of lines drawn in the sands of the Nazca Desert in Peru. The Nazca Desert is one of the driest regions on Earth, and it's also windless. Those conditions have preserved inscriptions in the desert sands for more than 1,000 years. Some of these extend over more than 9 kilometers. They were created between about 500 BC and 500 AD. This one represents a hummingbird. And this one, a monkey. There are literally hundreds of such inscriptions on the desert floor, but at ground level, pictures in the sand are completely unintelligible. So for whose eyes were they intended? Sky gods, extraterrestrials, or the tourists who now take day trips by plane from Lima to view them. These are two Australian paintings representing views from an aeroplane. For Margaret Preston, the view from on high turns elevation into plan, to borrow these terms from architecture. It reinforces her pedantic modernist imperative to flatten out pictorial space and to pattern her motifs in emphatically contrasted patches of tone and colour. There's little colour here, but that's one of the ways she alludes to the Aboriginal bush, the naturally occurring pigments, and the patterning effects that feature in Aboriginal bark paintings, with their representational conventions running counter to the naturalistic perspective and three-dimensional illusionism favoured in European art. The bark painting beside it is by Wanjuk Marika, a man of high lore among the Yirrachingu people of the Yolngu. In 1963, which was a very significant year in the Yolngu campaign for land rights, Wanjuk was acting as a spokesman and ambassador for his people, which brought him by plane to Sydney, where he was struck, just like Margaret Preston before him, by the intriguing congruency between the stretched-out, flattened, patterned view from on high of Sydney's suburban sprawl and the formal conventions of bark painting as practiced by his people in Arnhem Land. Paul Auster's novel Mr. Vertigo had substantial success when it was published in the early 1990s. The novel's protagonist develops an ability to fly, and his exploits prove to be totally and utterly believable to readers. Why should this be so? Probably because many of us have dreamt we can fly. According to a survey, about 36% of the people consulted reported that they had dreamt they could fly. Escaping from the pull of gravity and the heaviness and finiteness of our bodies, experiencing the thrill of ascent, the pleasure in weightlessness and complete liberty of movement in space. The important French writer Gaston Bachelard in 1943 published a book, L'air et les songes, in English, Air and Dreams, exploring how these fantasies had been taken up by a multitude of famous writers. Bachelard says almost nothing about visual artists, yet among them fantasies of weightlessness, of ascension, of mastery of the air are an old story, which gained a new lease of life in the early 20th century, which is the subject of this lecture, and the subject also of Robert Wall's comprehensive study that came out the same year as Paul Auster's novel. I acknowledge a great debt to Robert Wall's book, and I can recommend it highly. But before we consider anything else, we have to acknowledge the most enduring dream of flight in Western culture. It's the story of Daedalus and Icarus. Told, or rather retold, it was already a very old Greek tale, by Ovid, the Roman poet, in Book 4 of his Metamorphoses, which saw the light of day in the year 8 AD. It's, of course, a story of hubris. Daedalus, the fabulous artificer, creates two pairs of wings for himself and his son, Icarus. Icarus, being a daredevil and show-off, flies too high. The heat of the sun melts the wax of his wings, and he plummets to his death. And here we see him drowning in the sea, the splash of entry witnessed by a lone fisherman and a lone partridge, with no one else paying attention. The partridge, by the way, is Perdrix, who is an actual character in Ovid's tale. The last book of Ovid's Metamorphoses also represents an ascent into the air, not mythical, not metaphorical, but it's of its effort to visualize and make a concrete image of the apotheosis of Julius Caesar, the intended reader to whom of its metamorphoses was addressed was none other than the Emperor Augustus, Julius Caesar's adoptive son. The apotheosis of his adoptive father pertains to Julius Caesar's accession to divinity. Julius Caesar becomes a god. His spirit is swept heavenwards from his funeral pyre. And on the screen we see the Emperor Titus and the Empress Sabina, the wife of Hadrian, also being carried up to the realm of the gods. Titus on the back of an eagle, Sabina travelling first class in a reclining seat on the back of a victory. The imagery of apotheosis, showing how the human becomes divine, showing how one ascends to the realm of the supernatural, the blessed, the elect, the saintly, and the redeemed, gets taken up by Christian iconography, of course, in portrayals of the Last Judgment, where pagan victories have turned into angels. Rubens could deploy the imagery of apotheosis to be both pompous and somewhat deflationary, an approach that must have pleased and perhaps amused his patrons. But by the time of Tiepolo in the 18th century, the keynotes of the apotheosis, the keynotes of triumph, splendor, and magnificence, had become an entertaining spoof, a caprice that served to show off Tiepolo's incomparable set of skills, the divine, heavenly, sublime, imaginative capacity of the artist, rather than the preposterous pretension and presumptions of his aristocratic patrons. The capacity for imaginative displacement, for assuming points of view that aren't physically possible for us to obtain, is demonstrated with the most phenomenal virtuosity in this apotheosis of the Pisani family in the Villa Pisani at Stra, between Venice and Padua, which Tiepolo painted in 1762. Of course, seeing this image on the screen and making sense of it is itself an act of imaginative displacement, and you're probably imagining something compact. Yet in actuality, it's very, very large. It's the ceiling of a palatial ballroom, 23.5 by 13.5 meters, or 77 by 44 feet in extent. Tiepolo's imaginary conquest of the air brings to the fore his uncanny grasp of natural perspective, assessing relative distances and the alteration of size and alteration of tone and color of phenomena nearer or far away from his hypothetical point of view. Because the pull of gravity no longer pertains, and weightlessness prevails throughout the arena he has created, Tiepolo can associate shapes, masses, and colors with the freedom of an abstract painter. He's also given himself all the leeway in the world to demonstrate his ability to assume extreme and impossible vantage points, and to reveal again and again the wizardry of his foreshortened drawing. The effect on viewers, even on the blasé viewers of today, who've seen everything or think they have, is pretty amazing. Tiepolo's strategy is to show us things we don't immediately recognize. Those shapes are three cupids of the same size, flying at different heights, shown in different aspects. That's a winged figure with two trumpets, showing a lot of leg. But is the other leg missing? Here, one of the figures dangles a leg over the edge of the parapet, breaking the frame, projecting an illusion beyond the surface, beyond the unreality of the scene, seemingly entering the space of actuality. And there's another dangling leg, and the crook of an arm, and a bit of a torso. We correlate these dissociated parts into a body, a man. There are two rounded humps of fabric to the right. After a moment's pause, we realize they're the bottoms of two people, presumably men, bowing in reverence or submission. On the left are the tops of what may be pikes, furled flags, maybe a ship's sail, but they're too far beyond the fictitious edge of our perception to be identifiable. Tiepolo's fame and success throughout Europe was largely won through the princely commissions for his ceiling paintings. About 10 years earlier, he painted this ceiling of the Würzburg residence, the largest ceiling painting ever done, 18 by 30 meters, or 59 by 98 feet in extent. Strictly speaking, it's not an apotheosis, but the idea of apotheosis is unmistakably there. It's as full of invention as you could possibly wish, full of astonishing feats of foreshortened drawing, aerial perspective, carried through unbelievably complex and intricate layerings and concatenations, and things we know or thought we knew turned into riddles. The enigmatic mounds that turn out to be the rear ends of prostrate men, Tiepolo's favorite joke, gets an airing here as well. This most grandiose compositional juggling act and aerial ballet, seen here from opposite sides of the balcony, prophesizes in certain ways strategies that would be taken up 150 or so years later, strategies of deliberate estrangement, of defamiliarization, of radical displacement of an accustomed or expected point of view. These paintings Kandinsky did in 1912, though deliberately and wholeheartedly anti-virtuosic, are also aerial ballets where gravity doesn't pertain, where volume and mass have been shed, where space is evoked by overlapping and layering, and by suggestions of movement, by suggestions of translucency and transparency. If you consider these images as the representations of something objective and prior? Do they represent a situation that is very small or very large? Are we viewing the representation looking across and through it, or looking up, or looking down? The world Kandinsky evokes is a floating world, a world of relativity, a world of tenuous and fluctuating associations of mobile elements. And unlike Tiepolo, but like the avant-garde music currently being composed by Kandinsky's contemporaries in Vienna, notably by Arnold Schoenberg, Kandinsky's paintings are atonal. There's no safety net in a naturalistic tonality or in an enveloping atmosphere. Likewise, there's no pre-existing spatial arena. The space in these paintings is a relative of Cézannean space, created by the gaps and differentials between the rapport and accords. 1912 happens to be a very significant year in our narrative, because it's then that a number of painters show that they are starting to develop a head for heights. Fernand Léger showed this work in the Salon d'Automne in 1912, and the salient feature here is the ascending motif, the allusion to ascending columns of smoke. Columns of smoke, for Léger, were the harbingers of non-representation. They're opaque. They interrupt and subvert the coherence and legibility of a figurative subject, which the title tells us is a woman in blue. Here, too, there's no pre-existing arena of space, no atmosphere, and no aggregate tonality. To associate this painting with any figurative intention is no small challenge to viewers. And what we're given to see in compensation is a brand new language of abstract shapes and colors as arranged by a master composer. Fernand Léger had just hit his stride as a ranking modern artist in 1912. And to give you a sense of his prior development, to emphasize the ascending motif of columns of smoke and his strategies of dissociation and disruption, creating a clash of abstract and representational aspects. That's a painting from the previous year. And this is his entry point, so to speak, into the Cubist milieu, this very distinctive Cubist still life, where we're shown a table heaped with fruits totally unappealing to the appetite or to the sense of touch, fruits that are grey, brown, and black. The hypothetical vantage point is as if this were seen from the top of a ladder, or as if seen by Paul Auster's boy who could fly. Displacement, disorientation, loss of bearings, defamiliarization, these have emerged as deliberate strategies of modern artists, and the heightened degree of abstraction that we've noted was obviously a useful expedient in generating such effects. By 1912, the millionaire Russian industrialists Shukin in St. Petersburg and Morozov in Moscow had assembled what were in effect the first private museums of modern art in the world. Their collections had extraordinarily large holdings of Matisses and Picassos, but not a single Léger painting amongst them. However, Léger exhibited 5 paintings in Moscow in the 1912 Jack of Diamonds exhibition, along with a very elite cohort of avant-garde painters. And it was there, one may assume, that his Russian counterpart, Kasimir Malevitch, discovered in Léger's work something very much to his liking, particularly in Léger's radical strategies of disorientation and disruption. Here those strategies are further compounded by Malevitch. The implicit intervals and breathing spaces in Léger's paintings have totally collapsed. Planar elements are superimposed like posters stuck on a hoarding, and a real barometer has been attached to the painting on the left, emphasizing that the pictorial surface is just as real, just as opaque and concrete as the object attached to it. Malevitch called works of this kind his Zaum paintings, a word that has been translated as trans-rational. In effect, they're yet another instance of artists responding to Rimbaud's call for a dérèglement de tous les sens, of a disordering of the senses. Such a wholesale embrace of tumultuous multiplicity, dissociation, and simultaneity was in an obvious way a means of responding to the complexity of the modern city and of the sped-up style of living it fostered. Indeed, the title Malevitch gave to the painting on the right, An Englishman in Moscow, creates a sort of allegorical justification of Zaum, or transrational composition. With the depicted figure identified as a stranger, a foreigner, the clamor of signs he confronts us with signifies the figure's disorientation. The mystifying jumble describes what happens when things have no names, when they are unrecognizable, and when one has lost one's bearings. The Englishman could be called Mr. Vertigo. In very close contact with the painters and poets of the avant-garde in Russia, Victor Shklovsky was a brilliant literary theorist who developed a rationalization of what he called ostranony, and his rationalization of it became extremely famous. Ostranony can be translated as making strange. It is a strategy of deliberate estrangement and defamiliarization, already widely adopted by visual artists and creative writers. Probably influenced by Shklovsky's ideas, Bertolt Brecht in Germany developed a parallel theory of what he called a Verfremdungseffekt, or an alienation effect, which meant more or less the same thing. It was a jolt that made a person become more aware, more reflective. For Shklovsky, art can have a redemptive influence on people whose cognitive abilities have become dulled by habit, by familiarity, by routine. They've become automatized, but art can serve to reawaken the senses by distorting, by disordering and estranging perception, making us conscious of our sensations and returning us to the primacy of sight, sound, the magic of signs, the magic of language. Shklovsky's classic exposition of Ostranany is on the screen. We'll read through it. In order to restore sensation to our limbs, in order to make us feel objects, to make a stone stony, mankind has been given the expedient of art. The purpose of art is to lead us to the knowledge of a thing by means of active seeing rather than by recognition. By estranging objects and complicating form, the device of art prolongs perception and makes it laborious. The perceptual process in art has a purpose all of its own and ought to be extended to the utmost degree. Art is a means of experiencing the process of creativity. The artifact itself is unimportant. Ostranany, experiencing the world anew, witnessing it from a novel perspective. Who better to administer the jolt to the senses, which could promise a new lease of life to humanity, than the new masters of the air? These paintings are both entitled The Aviator by Malevitch on the left, Léger on the right. The conquest of the air was the latest and most sensational achievement that modern technology had sprung upon an unsuspecting world, and it was integrally linked to other very up-to-date phenomena, to intensive publicity generated through the popular media, and to high-speed photography, to action photography, to the snapshot, which had gained currency at the turn of the century, and also to motion pictures, which were becoming increasingly popular, sophisticated, and profitable in the 1910s. Charlie Chaplin was launched on the screen in 1914. The 1909 flight by Wilbur Wright in the environs of Rome carried a passenger with a movie camera, resulting in the first footage ever shot from an aeroplane. The conquest of the air took place in phases. The development of heavier-than-air aeroplanes initially relied on the design of the bicycle and the design of gliders. The first birdman in history was a glider. Otto Lilienthal, a German, made 2,000 glider flights starting in 1891 until he crashed to his death in 1896. The Wright brothers in the USA, in Dayton, Ohio, had made a modest fortune manufacturing bicycles and conceived their initial prototype aeroplane as a hybrid between bicycle and glider. The photo here was taken by Jacques-Henri Lartigue. Lartigue obtained his first camera in 1901, when he was only 7 years old. He must have been around 13 when he took this picture. Lartigue made something of a specialty photographing pioneering aviators, starting with the earliest record-breaking glider flights, followed in turn by the earliest aeroplanes. Even at such a young age, Lartigue could make money from the sale of his photos to magazines, which proved to be quite a lucrative business. He was an extremely precocious and enterprising kid who was encouraged to excel and to succeed by his wealthy, very enterprising family. The photo on the left would have been taken when Lartigue was 10 years old. It shows the takeoff of Gabriel Voisin's record-breaking glider flight. 25 meters was the farthest a man in a glider had ever flown in 1904. And 6 years later, Lartigue photographed the takeoff of his older brother, Zissou, in his glider. Wealthy adolescent kids and ambitious, determined birdmen were not so easy to tell apart in those early experimental years of aviation. The Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur, shifted their interest from designing bicycles to designing gliders, and it was then that they had to confront the crucial problem that continued to stump all their competitors: how to control the glider's movements once it was airborne. They realized it could be possible to do so by twisting the trailing edge of the glider's wings. And the system they devised, which they called wing warping, continues to operate in the design of every airplane up to the present. Here, a prototype airplane fitted with a motor and 2 propellers lifts off its launching rail with Orville piloting and Wilbur running alongside. On its 4th and final attempt at flight, the flyer remained aloft for 59 seconds and traveled 852 feet, which might not seem much, but proved it could be done, and that they were on the right track, and that they'd accomplished something no human being had ever done before. They'd conquered the air. By September 1905, their revisions of the design had so improved that Wilbur Wright was able to remain in the air for almost 40 minutes. And after this, the brothers devoted themselves to further improvements in order to patent the Wright Flyer, which had 2 propellers and a 35 horsepower motor. First, they offered their invention to the American government, which wanted nothing of it. They were turned down flat. Next, they made an offer to the British government, again with no success. But France. France. That was a different matter, and Wilbur was invited to bring his plane and give a demonstration at the racecourse at Anaudière, just outside of Le Mans. This is a commemorative souvenir of that sensational event at Anaudière on August 1908, illustrated in a popular magazine, Le Petit Journal. And here you see the turning point in the Wright brothers' scrapbooks, the moment when their achievement ceases to be an American phenomenon and becomes the sensation of France. By the time Robert Delaunay came to paint a series of 3 or 4 variations on this composition, between 1912 and 13, 4 or 5 years had passed since Wilbur Wright's demonstration at Anaudière. Airplanes were continually evolving. More and more people were learning to fly or had been passengers on flights, and popular interest in planes and flying was at a peak. The yellow rectangle that is so prominent in both these works is an advertising poster on the hoardings for Astra Constructions, which was the French manufacturer of Wright aeroplanes. The painting on the left was the one Robert Delaunay painted first. It's smaller than the painting on the right, which is 10 feet or 3.5 meters high. They're both called L'Équipe de Cardiff, the Cardiff team, and the source, or one of the sources of the image, is a newspaper photograph of rugby players. The plane in the sky isn't a Wright flyer, but a Voisin aeroplane, deriving its shape from a box kite. By this time, the Wright flyer had already met with stiff competition from other, mainly French, designers of aircraft. Delaunay sent a photograph of the early version of this composition to Franz Marc in Munich. Franz Marc was part of Kandinsky's circle, and he'd been very much taken with and had been very much influenced by Delaunay. But he didn't like this painting. He didn't like it at all. Marc held very esoteric ideas about modern art, and so in fact did Delaunay, but their inability to see eye to eye was extremely telling. Marc couldn't see beyond the flashy proclamation of Parisian worldliness. Hadn't modern art forsaken all traffic with photography when it shook off naturalism and turned towards abstraction? The retrograde reportage, the photographic sources so easy to infer, the plebeian sport of rugby, the garish advertising, all of this spectacular newness that Delaunay seemed so eager to flaunt on every level, Marc found all of it offensive. For Marc, as for others in the Kandinsky circle, their ideal, the aim of abstract art in particular, was to renounce materialism, topicality, this worldliness, and to go beyond into the timeless, the universal, the ineffable, that which was beyond naming and beyond knowing. How bitterly disappointing, then, what a betrayal of their expectations that Robert Delaunay had defected from his presumed high-mindedness. But Delaunay saw his variations on the Cardiff team quite differently and consistent with the idealist, anti-materialist beliefs he and Franz Marc thought that they had shared in common. The rugby player leaping upward to catch the ball has departed from the earth. The giant Ferris wheel, the Eiffel Tower, and the Voisin aeroplane represent ways people have devised to elevate themselves above their earthly destiny. Their elevation signifies the dawning of a new age, an era when people's ideas of time and space will be completely altered, when the exponential progress of science and technology will extend ad astra. It will reach for the stars. You'll be aware, of course, that Robert Delaunay has learnt a great deal from Cubism, the dialectic or the paradox of disconnection and connection, the gridding, the suggestion of collage, breaking up the background and breaking up the foreground and making them interpenetrate, simultaneity, the phenomenon we've seen espoused by Malevitch and Léger as well, is related to the contraction or to the collapse of spatial depth, which is also a contraction or collapse of time. Simultaneity is a spatio-temporal phenomenon. Robert Delaunay and his wife Sonia used the term simultanéisme to describe this effect, and they made a catchword of their particular brand of modernism. In the most pared-down version of the Cardiff team, which I would guess was the last version, phenomena have lost their solidity and are riven with gaps and invaded by the white voids of untouched primed canvas. The purging of mass and volume creates the effect of weightlessness and disincarnation in the figures and objects, the lightness of being, so characteristic of modern art from Impressionism onwards. The first exhibition of Cubist paintings ever held was Braque's exhibition at the Conquest Gallery on the Rue Vignon near La Madeleine in the center of Paris in November 1908. There was a perfunctory and condescending review by the critic Louis Vauxhall in the paper Gil Blas, and just below it a news item appeared reporting that the previous day the record for the altitude an aeroplane could fly had been broken by Wilbur Wright. These are photographs taken on that day. You see the balloons set at 30 meters high. Wilbur Wright outstripped all the other competitors by reaching a height of 110 meters. Robert Wohl, in the book about aviation and the Western imagination I mentioned earlier, described the complicity of the Wright brothers and the nature of their collaboration. It really is very impressive. For one thing, it sounds exactly like the creative relationship between Picasso and Braque over the 6 crucial years between 1908 and 1914. Here's what Robert Wohl wrote. The closeness of their collaboration was such that after 1900, it is difficult, perhaps impossible, to distinguish which technical breakthroughs and innovations could be ascribed to Wilbur or to Orville. We encounter the same sort of confusion when we trace the history of Cubism and try to discern the separate contributions of Braque and Picasso. Indeed, at some point, Picasso and Braque gave each other the nicknames of Orville and Wilbur, which they pronounced Orville and Vilbourg, Braque being Vilbourg and Picasso being Orville. They would go to the airfield at Issy-les-Moulineaux. This is a photograph by Lartigue again, to watch planes taking off and landing. There were air shows that became great social events. In 1912, that vintage year, during the spring, Picasso painted two works on an oval format. Incorporated into the still life is a red, white, and blue pamphlet. The actual pamphlet has been identified, which proclaims our future is in the air. This slogan signals the very moment when the austere, near monochromatic palette of the classic phase of Cubism we call analytic Cubism begins to change. To some extent, I think, the avoidance of colour was determined by the abject poverty of both artists and by their nocturnal habits. They didn't have electric lighting. They didn't even have gaslight. They painted by the light of kerosene lamps. Those patches of bright blue and red aren't simply discordant in colour, they're discordant in their materiality. Contrasting with the matte, nuanced browns, greys and whites, they are flat, shiny and gaudily bright. They're patches of Ripolin, an industrially produced household enamel paint, introduced here as a foreign substance at a moment when Picasso and Braque were incorporating heterogeneous substances, heterogeneous items into their paintings and drawings. In the late summer of 1912, Picasso and Braque had met up during their summer holidays in the south of France. Braque stayed in Sorgues, near Avignon, and you can see he's woven the name of Sorgues into this composition. After Picasso had returned to Paris, he wrote to tell Braque, quote, "I have adopted your papery and dusty procedures," meaning I've started to make paper collages, and I've started to experiment with admixtures that change the texture of the painted surface. This still life by Braque incorporates sawdust and maybe ash mixed in with the paint. The textural shifts are carried through with wonderful subtlety and sensitivity. Quite unprecedented possibilities are opened up for modern painting. And with the invention of collage, it's as if a new universe has opened. Braque not only made collages, he also made constructions out of paper and cardboard, none of which has survived. This photo is the only evidence we have of Braque's three-dimensional constructions, but there were others, apparently, that were sparer and more linear, which, Picasso said, reminded him of model aircraft. We can imagine how they looked by referring to Braque's paper collages, or indeed by referring to collages by Picasso, like this one, or like this, where everything heavy massive, encumbrant, has been swept away. It was the sight of the solitary aviator that caught the public's imagination. Flying in these rudimentary, flimsy aircraft was extremely dangerous. Visual artists, artists of the avant-garde, empathized with the romance and heroism of these pioneering birdmen. They too felt themselves to be pioneers. They were able to relate to the aviator's courage and asceticism, to the perils of being an innovator, to the loneliness of being the first to attempt something which had no precedent and no guarantee. Louis Blériot was a French industrial designer who'd made his first fortune from car headlamps he designed. He ploughed most of the profits into experimental prototype aircraft, none of which were airworthy until the Blériot 9. But it was the Blériot 11 which was his greatest success. It went into production and earned him a fortune. Blériot was the first to fly over the English Channel from Calais to Dover in 1909 and became the hero of France. His glamour proved irresistible to Robert and Sonia Delaunay. The Delaunays were a married couple. Their synergy and complicity was comparable to that of Braque and Picasso. Intending to make a big splash at the Salon des Indépendants in 1914, the Delaunays and their American friend Patrick Henry Bruce submitted very large paintings, 2.5 meters square. Unfortunately, Bruce's painting no longer exists, but we have a glimpse of it in a photograph, and its impact, together with the Delaunays, would have been stunning. Robert's painting is titled Homage to Blériot, a showstopper in its scale, in the visual excitement it generates, and in the ultramodernity of its subject. Sonia's companion painting wasn't to be overshadowed by her husband's work. It's a masterpiece of early abstraction. Curiously enough, the patchwork idiom characteristic of Sonia's, Robert's, and Patrick Henry Bruce's paintings of the time seems to have had its source in real patchwork. Sonia made this quilt for her baby son in 1911. This is an installation shot of a retrospective exhibition of Sonia Delaunay's at the Centre Pompidou, where you'll see one of the eye-catching patchwork garments she created in the 1910s. Robert had jackets and trousers to complement Sonia's outfits when they stepped out to nightclubs and dance halls. Behind the garment, to the right, you'll see a painting with an immense lateral expanse about 4 meters across. The image is handled like a long frieze, a frieze that modulates between figurative and abstract. The painting is called Le Bal Bullier. It's the name of a popular dance hall. Sonia painted it around the time that Robert was preoccupied with his variations on the Cardiff rugby players, reaching for the sky, and it's possible to see the same aeronautical inspiration, the conquest of the air, affecting the character of Sonia's work as well. This is what the Le Bal Bullier dancehall looked like. There's no direct relationship between the decor and Sonia's painting. However, if you give her paintings, or if you give her needlework and tailoring a different background, it's evident how the patchwork mimics what an aviator can see from on high. In reality, her painting of Le Balboulier doesn't operate like a conventional picture. You have to step back to see it as a totality, but it's too big, too wide. You have to step back too far to do this. Instead, you traverse its span from a normal viewing distance and follow its mutations and modulations. The experience is like gliding across a sweeping lateral terrain. We're back in Russia. It's 1914. A few wealthy young men have learned to fly. One of them is Vasily Kamensky, who began flying in 1910. This poster advertises an avant-garde happening in Moscow. The airman, Kamensky, will talk about airplanes and the poetry of the futurists. The other speakers are the painter David Blériot and the poet Vladimir Mayakovsky. There were two Russian artists who responded directly and explicitly to the conquest of the air as a historical event: Kasimir Malevitch and Vladimir Tatlin. Their works proceed directly from trends and precedents established in Paris, but entirely transcended any influences and borrowings from Cubism in particular. As we've seen, Malevitch became fascinated by the mechanomorphic aspects of Cubists such as Léger, and of the Italian futurists as well. Anticipation of an industrialized world and of a hegemonic modernity that would make a clean slate and would sweep everything before it. These were the dangerous fantasies of pre-revolutionary Russian artists and intellectuals. Malevitch and Rodchenko were egregious flight-fantasists. We began this lecture with a quote from Malevitch about his striving for space, his yearning to leave the earth, to reach for the sky. Malevitch was a charismatic and inspiring teacher. He assembled pedagogical material for his students, some of which has survived. These charts evidently come from a stint of teaching in Germany, most likely at the Bauhaus. They show the kinds of subjects, the kinds of imagery favored by the various factions in the world of contemporary art. For Cubists, it's steel-framed enclosures like the marketplace at Les Halles in Paris, poster hoardings, newspaper layout, stall fronts, musical instruments, cafe tables, etc. For futurists, it's speed, athletics, wheels, crowds, trains, dirigibles, factories. Then the suprematists, that is to say, Malevitch and his faction of avant-garde painters. They're interested in emptiness and distance, desert landscapes, looking down at an urban industrial sprawl from high altitudes. There's an aeroplane and a man in a cable car. There are feats of cantileverage in engineering and so on. And these are images from another chart of this kind that Malevitch compiled for students, illustrating the proclivities of suprematist painters, views downwards to complex urban configurations, or looking upwards at a flock of migrating birds, looking at a squadron of airplanes, planes and planes and yet more planes here. This exhibition gave lasting fame to Malevitch in the history of modern art, the 010 exhibition held in St. Petersburg at the end of 1915. It was subtitled The Last Futurist Exhibition. Goodbye to futurism, but welcome to its even more advanced successor. Tatlin also exhibited in 010 and showed equivalently novel, uncompromising abstract sculptures. During the following year, Malevitch began to bandy about the word suprematism to describe his new aesthetic. Kandinsky had observed that Cubism, when it was applied consistently and understood consistently, led to the ultimate degree of disintegration and destruction of material connections between the parts of objects. You see these implications borne out by Malevitch's compositional stratagems. Cubism, according to Malevitch's own appraisal, liberates us from a dependency on the already created forms of nature and technology in our surroundings and sets artists on the path of absolute, inventive, immediate creation. So the suprematist composition completes and consummates the liberation of parts which can freely associate, which are liberated into sheer relativity. Characteristic of modern art, as we've seen in the past, from Impressionism onwards, a painting by Malevitch represents both destruction and creation, analysis and synthesis, a breaking down and a building up. The simple units Malevitch exposes to his viewers are like parts of a kit, and there's an invitation to imagine other ways of putting them together, notwithstanding, of course, the fact that Malevitch composes these images with the most exquisite sophistication. In fact, this painting is called House Under Construction. The other flight fantasist, Malevitch's co-exhibitor in 010, was Vladimir Tatlin. Tatlin had been fired up by the modern French art he saw in Shukin's collection in St. Petersburg, and he'd gone to Paris, where he'd visited Picasso's studio sometime in 1914. And there he would have been able to see collages as well as, we think, some of Picasso's three-dimensional constructions. He would also have been able to lay hands on this magazine, Les Soirées de Paris, which contained the first photographs published of Picasso's Cubist constructions in 3 dimensions. From this ensued Tatlin's first constructions in metal, which were completely abstract, transposing a graphic language of lines and planes into 3-dimensional forms. There's no base, no enframing rectangle, volume and mass have disappeared into irrelevance. Sheet metal, wire, and paint are the materials. It's a completely new kind of modern sculpture. During his visit to Paris, Tatlin had ample opportunity to take in the awe-inspiring feat of engineering that was the Eiffel Tower. During the heady days after the victory of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, Tatlin proposed a symbol for the glorious possibilities that the revolution had opened up for visionary artists and forward-looking creative thinkers. It was to be a steel-framed tower rising 3 times higher than the Eiffel Tower. Tatlin's conviction was that artists of the new age, artists of the new society, wouldn't and couldn't remain in their traditional mode, withdrawn and at variance with society, self-involved, impractical. As a would-be engineer and a would-be industrial designer, Tatlin was in fact completely hopeless. These photos illustrate a chapter in a monograph which is called Unbuildable Tatlin. Totally impractical too was Tatlin's project to build a glider, a work of his which, like the failed monument to the Third International, has nonetheless made it into the history of modern sculpture. Tatlin sought to emulate Leonardo da Vinci, the artist as inventor, the artist as intellectual and polymath, the dreamer of the future. This is a reconstruction of the Tatlin glider, an anticlimactic end to this lecture about the dream of flight, but then maybe not so. Thank you for your interest. See you again.